In a narrow Alaska bay, a wave climbed the mountainside to a height of 1,719 feet, stripping the slope bare of trees. It remains the largest megatsunami in modern times. 2 fishermen nearby were lifted into the air by the surge and survived. This is the earthquake and rockslide that caused it. Lituya Bay cuts into the Alaska coast as a narrow T-shaped fjord carved by retreating glaciers. It stretches 7 miles deep but only 2 miles wide, plunging to 722 feet at its deepest point, while its mouth is barely 33 feet deep. At its head, the Gilbert and Crillon inlets trace the fault line about to rupture. In the 170 years before that night, Lituya Bay had already produced 4 tsunamis taller than 100 feet in 1854, 1899, 1936, and finally 1958. The tallest of the earlier 3 reached 490 feet in 1936. Nothing, though, compared to what was coming. On July 9, 1958, the ground beneath the Fairweather fault gave way. The quake reached a magnitude between 7.8 and 8.3. It was the strongest earthquake to hit the region in over 50 years, since a magnitude 8.2 quake in 1899. People felt it across 400,000 square miles, from Alaska down to Seattle and east into Canada's Yukon. The tremor registered as intensity 11, extreme on the Mercalli scale, the maximum perceived intensity of the quake. Its epicenter sat in the Fairweather Range, about 13 miles southeast of Lituya Bay itself, directly in the path of what the fault was about to send down. Somewhere on the wall above Gilbert Inlet, a slab of rock several hundred meters up sheared away from the mountainside. More than 30 million cubic meters of it, some 90 million tons, dropped as a single mass into the water below. It fell less like a landslide than a hammer blow. The impact was so violent it could be heard 80 kilometers away, 50 miles down the coast. In Gilbert Inlet itself, the falling rock slammed into the water and drove it outward with tremendous force. The first motion of what would become the largest megatsunami in modern times. Bill and Vivian Swanson were anchored on their fishing boat near the bay's entrance when the quake struck. They watched the mountains shake loose rock and snow, and then something impossible happened to the glacier. Swanson later described it plainly. The glacier had risen in the air and moved forward so it was in sight. Moments later, a wall of water came over the point, heading straight for them. The waves run up scoured up to 400 meters of ice off the front of the Lituya Glacier and tore away its rocky deltas. Scientists later found that a subglacial lake near the glacier's bend had dropped by 100 feet, a clue that fed a competing theory about what triggered the wave. Howard Ulrich and his 7-year-old son were anchored aboard their boat, the Edry, on the bay's southern side. Ulrich watched the wave take shape in Gilbert Inlet. He described it starkly. It was not a wave at first. It was like an explosion or a glacier slough. He also insisted the water never truly climbed 1,800 feet. At that height, it was only splash. The main wave reached the Edry 2 to 3 minutes later, carrying the boat toward the southern shore and back out near the bay's center. Once it passed, Ulrich regained control, steering through smaller waves as high as 20 feet before finally motoring out. What Ulrich and the Swansons had witnessed reached a scale no one had recorded before. The waves surged up the slope at the head of Gilbert Inlet and stripped trees away to 524 meters above the bay's surface, 1,719 feet. It stands as the largest, most significant megatsunami recorded in modern times. 5 people died and many others were injured or left homeless as the wave tore through the bay. 2 people aboard a fishing boat were killed outright. A fishing boat captain and his 7-year-old son were struck by the wave and hurled into the air by the swell. Remarkably, both survived with only minor injuries. In Yakutat, the only permanent settlement near the epicenter, the damage was immediate. Bridges, docks, and oil lines were all damaged. A wave tower collapsed, and a cabin was wrecked beyond repair. Sand boils and fissures opened in the ground to the southeast, and underwater cables carrying the Alaska communication system were severed. Farther from the epicenter, in Pelican and Sitka, the damage was lighter but still felt. Around Lituya Bay itself, the wave tore limbs from trees and swept much of the forest away, leaving the high tide line barren. Only at the northern and southern edges did any trees remain standing. The megatsunami flooded the entire bay, carving a damage line up to 213 meters, about 699 feet, around its full outline. Decades later, that scar is still visible from space, a permanent signature of the day the water climbed higher than it ever had before. Long before 1958, Lituya Bay had a habit of doing this. Early explorers reported shorelines stripped bare of trees, with cut tree lines climbing the slopes. The Frenchman Count de La Pérouse, the first European to record the bay, logged the same kind of damage when he arrived in 1786. Photographs show at least one, possibly two, more waves struck between 1854 and 1916. Then in 1936, a fresh Megatsunami erased that earlier evidence, uprooting trees more than 150 meters, about 490 feet, up the sides of the bay, the last such event before 1958. For decades, scientists have debated exactly what triggered the wave. Was it the rockfall the earthquake dropped into the inlet, or a mechanism tied to the earthquake itself? Neither a draining glacial lake nor the shaking alone could fully account for a wave this size. Researchers have run study after study trying to nail down the real cause. A 1999 study concluded that the wave was caused primarily by that enormous rockfall crashing into Gilbert Inlet as a single mass, triggered by the earthquake's ground motion. The impact gouged a crater in the sediment below, uplifted ice along the glacier's front, and threw up a splash that reached the full 1,720-foot elevation on the inlet's far side. Mathematical models built at Los Alamos National Laboratory later tested that explanation using the volume of water and the depth of sediment in the inlet. The simulations reproduced the documented run-up almost exactly, giving strong support to the rockfall as the driving force behind the wave. A 2010 study went further, comparing the volume of sediment now sitting on the bay floor to what the rockfall alone could explain, and found it many times too large. The likely answer: a dual slide. The rockfall's impact broke off 400 meters of glacier ice and released trapped sediment underneath. A second slide 5 to 10 times bigger than the first. Lituya Bay's 1958 wave forced scientists to rethink what makes a giant wave: not just earthquakes and storms, but rockfalls and landslides crashing into narrow inlets. That rethinking mattered. In 2015, a strikingly similar wave struck Icy Bay, just up the Alaska coast, proof that this fjord's terrifying trick was never a one-time event.